Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of our Justice and Pieces guest speaker series. Today, we're going to kick off our Meet the Lawyer bencher candidates. And as always, the views and opinions are of the candidates alone. They don't reflect me, Justice and Pieces, Trias College, or any of the education institutions or organizations I'm affiliated with. So today, to start it off, we have Will joining us. Now, Will, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. And thanks again for taking the time and speaking with us.
Sure. I'm Will McDowell. I'm a partner at Lensner Slatt. I'm in my 35th year, I guess, of call to the bar. I practiced at McCarthy Tetro for quite a number of years, and then I was Associate Deputy Minister of Justice for 3 years, and I've been at Lensner Slatt since 2008. And I was a bencher for 8 years, 2011 to 2019.
Now, with that experience there of being a bencher for 8 years, why come back and why run here in 2023? What's the reason Will is back running for bencher?
Well, Will is back, having looked with some dismay over the past 4 years. I was a bencher for 8 years, and I was a member of the Racialized Licensees Task Force. And it was really disheartening to see that it was one recommendation that was accepted by convocation that led to the situation we found ourselves in 2019, where this well-organized group rose up the Stop the Statement of Principles slate, and they captured the profession by storm. They elected, I guess, 20 or 22 benchers. And that meant that they were in a position to be able to block convocation from carrying on its ordinary business. And they did this very successfully. They created enormous dysfunction. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that very little was accomplished in convocation over the past 4 years. So there's that problem, because there's important work to be done in legal education and regulating artificial intelligence going forward. But there's also a real risk to self-regulation. We've had self-regulation of the legal profession since 1797 in this province, but we can't afford this dysfunction, or the next government of whatever political stripe is going to say in 5 or 7 or 8 years, enough's enough, we're just going to appoint benchers to run the profession. And that's something I really don't want to see happen.
Now, with that in mind, I guess at some point too, well, is it a little bit problematic or hypocritical that, in response to, this well-organized slate, that had elected 22 and are putting forth, I think, 35 candidates this time, that, the Good Governance Coalition is essentially doing the same thing, right? Is it kind of, pointing the fingers at, there's this meme of like the Spider-Man that they're basically pointing at the same thing. What would you say kind of in response? Is this kind of necessary, or how would you respond to kind of that criticism that you're doing essentially the same thing?
Well, it is necessary. Historically, what has happened is that, I would get endorsements from a number of prominent lawyers in different parts of the province that I knew, as would every other bencher, and some associations. So the Black Lawyers Association or the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers would endorse certain candidates, as would the South Asian Association. And that unfortunately leads to vote splitting. And where you have a slate on the other side that is quite regressive in what it thinks about various things, then is it ideal to have to put a slate together to combat that? No, it's not. But it's necessary. It's really necessary, because our message is, don't just vote for Will McDowell, vote for the entire slate and the Good Governance Coalition. Because if we have the same vote splitting as we've had historically, then the Full Stop group is going to have control of convocation. It's that simple.
Now, could you perhaps, I guess, with that, share some of the vision there that the candidates of the Good Governance Coalition collectively have, and maybe which of those are the most important to you personally, Will?
Well, there's a view on the other side of the aisle that the Law Society should stick to its core functions. And that's just misinformed, because the Law Society, by Section 4.2 of the Law Society Act, is supposed to have certain animating principles. One of them is to advance the cause of justice. Another one has to do with access to justice. Number one. Number two, the Law Society just doesn't do self-regulation in the strictest sense. It doesn't just discipline its members. It writes the rules that govern contingency fees, for example. It has formulated anti-money laundering principles. It determines the length of articling terms and whether or not there should be minimum compensation for articling students. It has a really strong role to play in legal education. And, for example, it funds in substantial part the system of county law libraries across the province, which are, kind of the nuclei, the little nerve centers in each of these county towns. So it has a much broader role than the full stop slate would like to think. And we have to work very carefully to tend all of these areas to make sure they're all properly funded and to make sure that we've got a working convocation. We can't just say, well, ideally, we'd like individual lawyers' fees paid to the Law Society of Ontario to be lower, so we're going to arbitrarily say we're going to cut by 25% or cut by 10%. That's just irresponsible. We can't fulfill our statutory mandate doing that. So we want to bring experience and competence and a cooperative spirit back to convocation.
Now, Will, if you and the other coalition members are elected, in terms of this vision and putting it into sort of practical terms, what are the things that, from I think it's May 15th or whenever you take office, that you would prioritize are the most important that needs to be done in terms of, addressing what's happened over the last 4 years?
Well, we have to have working committees of convocation back again. And the way this has historically worked and worked well is that you have a committee dealing with professional regulation. I was the chair of that committee for 5 or 6 years. That committee formulates policy proposals. It brings them to convocation as a whole. They get voted on. And those committees work quite separately from the whole of convocation. What has happened over the past 4 years is that the members of the stop slate would show up and interfere with the work of the committees, even though they weren't members of the committees. So that's a really important thing, just to get functioning committees back in place. Another thing is just to get the tone of convocation back to what it was, which was with civility really, really, really on display at all times. When I was a bencher, we had many debates where there were sharply differing points of view with respect to the Trinity Western issue, for example, with respect to the abolition of articling. People disagreed absolutely on some of these points, but the tenor of the debate was always civil. That has not been the case in the past 4 years, where you've had benchers serving libel notices on the treasurer, benchers fighting over the rulings made by the treasurer concerning the conduct of proceedings, where you've got one bencher who's a fiduciary of the Law Society suing the Law Society to get access to certain information. All of that has to go. We just have to get back to doing the business that the profession expects us to do, and doing it in a civil way.
Now, again, in terms of the full stop now, I mean, I think the pillars that they're running on, at least on their website, is stop bloke, stop creep, stop woke. And, a chance to respond to that in terms of their messaging. Why, if they're elected, would this continue, as you're saying, from the last 4 years, problems there with the Law Society, that you point out maybe could lead to self-regulation? What's the main issue there, if they are elected, that is concerning to you, and which galvanized, the Good Governance Coalition to put together, a team of 45 candidates?
Well, stop creep and stop below. Take those by themselves. There is no mission creep in the Law Society if you look at what the Law Society by statute is supposed to do. There's all of this complaint about the diversity programs that the Law Society runs. But first of all, I would say that they're actually required by the statutory mandate, but also they're 1% of the Law Society's budget. So those two pillars, to me, just seem to be kind of fear-mongering. And then there's stop woke. I'm not sure what they mean by woke. I think it's kind of a dog whistle way of saying we don't like programs that call attention to the diversity of the profession, and we don't like the idea that individual racialized groups somehow might get the benefit of these programs. One of them, Jared Brown, has actually said that he thinks that there's special status for racialized groups at convocation. That's just, I'm really troubled by that. I'm really troubled by that. And I'll give you an example of issues that arise at the Law Society. So a number of years ago, when I was in convocation, was the chair of the Professional Regulation Committee, the Law Society undertook a prosecution of a lawyer in Northwestern Ontario who had been dealing with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process for compensating survivors. And the Law Society formed the view that he had misconducted himself in doing that. So it went to Northwestern Ontario and it interviewed a great number of people, many of whom were Anishinaabe, who didn't speak English well, or sometimes didn't speak it at all, and who were going to be witnesses at this prosecution. The prosecution fell apart. Why did it fall apart? Because we at the Law Society, I think, were culturally illiterate in dealing with that part of the population. So what did we do? We undertook internal programming and internal education of our investigators, of our prosecutors, of the way in which we had approached this problem. And we had a great deal of Indigenous education to get that cultural literacy. Now, is that something that is woke and therefore objectionable? No. The Law Society has to serve the public, and here is a part of the public which it had disserved, and it had to learn how to do a better job. Now, I'm sure on the other side, they would roll their eyes and say, oh, that's just an overreaction. That's buying into woke ideology. That's giving special status to this Indigenous group. It isn't. It's fulfilling the statutory mandate as we are required to do. Oh, and by the way, it's the right thing to do. It's the only decent thing to do as a regulator.
Yeah, because I hear certainly there's decisions where it says for lawyers. I think there's something recently about being culturally competent, regardless of what that culture is, or trauma informed lawyering, and on the other side, I've heard I've spoken to paralegal bencher candidates. Some are saying, well, we should just scrap the EDI requirement altogether. So in terms of looking at some of these issues where there's very diametrically opposed views, again, looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion, what are sort of the ideas, in terms of, again, practically speaking, and perhaps maybe also address, I see some posts there, comments that, hey, if the good governance were elected, they're going to bring the statement of principles back. Perhaps maybe you can kind of comment on some of those issues there.
Sure. Well, let me deal with the statement of principles first. This was something that came from a good place. It came from the idea that, just as we say to real estate lawyers, you should certify that you're aware of the regulations dealing with protection of data, which is something that we had done. This was saying to all lawyers, you should be aware of the special position we have in society and aware of the legal requirements in relation to racialized groups. It got blown all out of proportion. It was poorly explained. Frankly, it was a bad idea because the flame wasn't worth the candle. And I think everybody involved in that process would now recognize that. So no one wants to bring back the statement of principles. It's the statement of principles that caused, in some way, this dysfunction for 4 years. So we're driving past that. There is no plan to do that. There is, in fact, a commitment among the candidate members of the Coalition for Good Governance not to do that. But there is equally a commitment to protect the EDI apparatus, to protect, for example, the Office of Discrimination and Harassment Council, which has been around for 20 years, which has been really important to members of the profession who are racialized and also who are women who have experienced discrimination, who have been very isolated in trying to deal with this, and had someone to reach out to who could then be a voice for them in resolving these issues. Again, it's quite troubling that the DHC office would be under attack, because it has been a very important safeguard against abuse in our profession of people who are vulnerable.
And in terms of, I guess, some of the other areas, right, that I mean, this often being the biggest one, but what are some of the other areas there in terms of, if elected, the coalition is going to look at in terms of, from your vision there, right, in terms of, putting that into, from your experience of being a bencher for 8 years, some changes that may need to go in place to kind of return back to maybe those times?
Well, I think that we have to provide assurance to the racialized members of the profession that the apparatus that's in place to protect them is safe, that no one is going to attack that. But there are other things. So, for example, artificial intelligence is now a growing issue in regulation of the legal profession. To what extent can you use chatbots to create content that is sold to clients? What are the safeguards in using material generated by artificial intelligence? How do we police that? Are we able to police that? This is a massive issue that we will have to come to terms with going forward. And we also have to come to terms with the problem that, notwithstanding we've looked at the articling issue multiple times going back 50 years, we still have people in the profession, or people who want to join the profession, who have completed their law school degree, who have tried to find articles and have been unable to find articles. I mean, I would say that the LPP program at TMU has been a great success, but there are still, I think, hundreds of students in Ontario who can't find articles and therefore can't be called to the bar. And that's something that we should address. And again, on our side of the ledger, there will be different views about this. I'm coming around to the view that we should have a rigorous bar exam that anybody who's done a law degree can write, which is the system in New York State, for example. But I'm open to ideas about that, and I know that various members of our coalition, whom I respect greatly, have different views about that. But this is an issue that we're going to have to deal with over the next 4 years, whoever is elected, whoever are elected as benchers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was certainly an important issue. I mean, I can even relate personally to the struggles of getting articling, but decades ago there, right? But I know there was this whole debate about whether articling should there be paid a minimum wage.
Right.
Even for paralegal students now, I think they've recently increased the minimum hours to 240 hours. But I mean, what are some, and within that framework, as well as you mentioned, how does it work with, if let's say the coalition, all of you get elected, hypothetically, or no, most of you, however, but is it like a party system where going forward, the coalition is going to kind of sort of have the whip and crack the whip there, how you're going to vote? Maybe you can kind of elaborate on that issue. And as you pointed out, there's differences of opinion within the group itself.
No, look, I just pointed to one, which is the whole question of how to solve the ongoing articling problem. But take another example. The members of Full Stop say we should have disclosure of the salaries of Law Society employees over a certain threshold. That is something that I have actually thought about over the years, and have thought at least the very top members of the Law Society should have their salaries public. that's a position I've taken repeatedly, or I took repeatedly over the 8 years that I was a bencher. I'm out of step, I think, with most of my colleagues in my own coalition, but am I going to get kicked out of this coalition? Am I going to have sanctions imposed? No, because there's recognition that reasonable people can disagree about a lot of these things. There are some core things where I think reasonable people can't disagree or shouldn't disagree, but there'll be a whole slew of issues where they do. So it's not like a political party.
Now, in terms of no, I certainly have students that are listening. Perhaps maybe you could speak to them in terms of as they look to enter into the profession. Any words of wisdom that you can offer up for them?
Well, number one is be resilient. Never give up. Never give up, because it's a long road, and there will be times, and certainly in the 35 years I've been practicing, there are times when you think, I've made a terrible mistake, or I'm not going to get this job, or I've done my last case. And if you just keep trying, as a judge said to me when I was just starting out, if you do a great job on the brief that is on your desk, I'm a litigation lawyer, if you do a great job on that task, there will always be another one. And I don't think that's just superstition. I think that is the experience of being a lawyer. The second thing I would say is be part of the legal community. Make friends. If you have transactions, if you're a commercial lawyer, take the people on the other side of the transaction out to lunch. If you lose a case in court with somebody, or you settle a case, have coffee with those lawyers, because this connectivity is important for a number of reasons. It's important, frankly, for business reasons, but it's also important because you learn from everybody you run across, right? You can learn something from everybody in every case, even if it's just what you don't want to do. You can learn something in every transaction. And then the third thing I would say, and I've said this before, is there is an incredible importance to empathy in what we do for a living. That, you have unlimited opportunities in the practice of law to harm people just because you can. But that's not the way you should practice. You should always look at these things, say, am I going to compromise the rights of my client if I give a little here? And if the answer is no, and if it's going to promote a good outcome, you should be empathetic, because I think that is, in many ways, the glue that holds the profession together.
Now, is there anything, in terms of 30 minutes usually goes by pretty quickly here, but anything that maybe we've not talked about that you want to address in terms of this election that's coming up, and thanks again for taking the time and joining us.
Well, I am concerned about some of the things that some of the members of the Full Stop slate say on social media. So, Mr. Desgrange, for example, the other day, I looked, and he had retweeted some very troubling things about Ukraine, involving some imagery that was quite offensive. And there are other examples about this. And this isn't to demonize people in the other slate, some of whom I've known for many, many years. But I think that our friends on the other side of the aisle have to look and say, we should require minimum standards of behavior from our member candidates. And they haven't done that. And that is something that worries me, because this is a creeping problem in society generally. I've also been quite concerned about some of the misinformation that I've seen from the Full Stop group. That misinformation has become a tool of the trade in politics of the right south of the border. This seems to be just importing it to Canada, and I'm quite troubled by that.
Finally, the last question here, Will, is then look at it the other way. Why should the lawyers that are listening to this, why should they be voting for you and for the rest of the Good Governance Coalition?
First of all, more important to vote for the coalition than for me or for any individual candidate. They should do it because they should bring competence back to convocation to get a law society that is working for them, and to have a functioning regulator rather than one that is just buried in dysfunction.
Perfect. So thanks so much again, Will, for taking the time and joining us. Wish you all the best, and take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye now.